It is the summer of 168 before Christ, and a Macedonian army of over 26,000 men stands in battle formation on a flat, dusty plain near the town of Pydna, in the coastal lowlands south of Mount Olympus. At the centre of their line is the phalanx, 16 ranks deep, shoulder to shoulder, each man gripping a sarissa pike nearly 18 feet long. When this formation advances, it presents a wall of sharpened iron points so dense that no force in the known world has been able to break through it head-on, not in living memory, not in the memory of anyone's grandfather. For over 150 years, since the days of Philip II and his son Alexander, the Macedonian phalanx has been the most feared instrument of war in the Mediterranean world. It conquered the Persian Empire. It smashed every Greek city-state that defied it. It carried Macedonian arms from the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Indus River. And now, on this summer day, the phalanx is advancing again, toward a Roman army that has crossed the Adriatic and marched into the kingdom's heartland. The Roman commander is Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a 60-year-old consul who has seen decades of military service. He stands on a slight rise behind his legions, watching the Macedonian phalanx begin its forward push. Years later, the Greek historian Plutarch would record that Paulus admitted the sight of the advancing phalanx filled him with alarm and astonishment. He had never seen anything like it. The sheer mechanical discipline of thousands of men moving as a single, bristling mass, pikes lowered, shields locked, the ground shaking under their synchronized step. It was enough to unsettle even a veteran Roman general. And that is where we begin. Because this moment, the collision at Pydna, is the moment that broke Greek military power forever. Within hours, the Macedonian king Perseus would be a fugitive. Within months, the kingdom founded by Alexander's heirs would cease to exist as an independent state. And within a generation, every corner of the Greek-speaking world, from Athens to Corinth to the islands of the Aegean, would be absorbed into the Roman system. A civilization that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, that had produced the phalanx, the trireme, the fortified city-state, and some of the most sophisticated military thinking in the ancient world. That civilization was about to be conquered by a republic from central Italy that most Greeks, just a few generations earlier, had barely considered worth noticing. This is the story of how Rome conquered Greece, and it is not the story most people expect. It is not a story of one decisive battle, or of one brilliant general, or of some secret Roman weapon that the Greeks could not answer. The real story is longer, more complicated, and far more revealing. It stretches across nearly 70 years of wars, diplomatic crises, betrayals, sieges, and devastating miscalculations. It involves 3 full-scale wars against the Kingdom of Macedon, a catastrophic war against the Seleucid Empire, and a final, punishing campaign against a Greek confederation that refused to submit. And the factor that decided it, the factor that turned Rome from a regional Italian power into the master of the Greek world, was not a single hero or a stroke of luck. It was something structural, something built into the way Rome organized its armies, managed its alliances, and sustained military operations across enormous distances year after year without breaking. The Romans won because they could absorb punishment and keep coming. They won because their military system was designed not around one devastating strike, but around relentless operational persistence, the ability to raise new armies after catastrophic losses, to keep supply lines open across the Adriatic Sea, to rotate commanders without losing institutional knowledge, and to turn temporary setbacks into long-term strategic advantages. The Greeks, for all their brilliance, were fighting with a military model that depended on winning the single decisive engagement. When they won that engagement, they were formidable. When they didn't, or when the war dragged on beyond one campaigning season, their system began to crack. But to understand why that mattered, and how it played out on real ground against real armies, we need to go back before Pydna, back before Rome had any significant presence in the Greek world at all, back to the moment when Rome first looked east across the Adriatic and saw not an opportunity but a threat. Rome is in the worst crisis of its existence. Hannibal Barca and his Carthaginian army have been rampaging through the Italian peninsula for 3 years. At the Battle of Cannae, fought the previous summer, Hannibal destroyed a Roman army of roughly 80,000 men in a single afternoon, the worst military disaster in Roman history. Roman dead lay piled across the fields of Apulia in numbers that shocked the ancient world. Several of Rome's Italian allies had defected. The city of Capua, the second largest in Italy, had switched sides. Syracuse, the great Greek city in Sicily, was negotiating with Carthage. Rome's position looked desperate, and it was at exactly this moment, with Hannibal undefeated on Italian soil, with allied cities in revolt, with Roman manpower stretched to its absolute limit, that a message arrived from across the Adriatic. Philip V, the young and ambitious king of Macedon, had signed a treaty of alliance with Hannibal. The terms were clear. Macedon and Carthage would cooperate against Rome. If Hannibal won the war in Italy, Philip would receive a free hand in the western Greek world and along the Adriatic coast, including the Greek cities of southern Italy that Rome considered within its sphere of influence. Think about that for a moment. Rome is already fighting for survival against the greatest military mind of the age, and now the most powerful kingdom in the Greek world has joined the enemy coalition. Philip commands a professional Macedonian army, a functioning fleet, and the resources of a kingdom that stretches from the Aegean to the borders of Illyria. If he lands troops in Italy, or even ties down Roman forces along the Adriatic coast, the pressure on Rome could become unbearable. This is the event that dragged Rome into Greek affairs, not ambition, not imperial planning, not some long-held Roman desire to dominate the East. It was a defensive reaction to a strategic threat at the worst possible time. Philip's alliance with Hannibal forced Rome to open a second front, across the sea, in a region its commanders barely knew, against a military system they had never faced in full force. And that decision, made under extreme pressure, set in motion a chain of wars that would not end until Rome had dismantled the entire Greek state system. The first of these conflicts is known as the First Macedonian War, and it is the war that most people skip over. It lasted roughly 11 years and ended without a decisive result. But it matters enormously because it established the pattern that would define every Roman intervention in Greece that followed. Rome could not afford to send a major army to Greece. Every available legion was needed in Italy, in Spain, or in Sicily. So instead of committing to a full-scale invasion, the Roman Senate did something characteristically pragmatic. They found local allies. The Aetolian League, a confederation of Greek city-states in central Greece that had its own bitter grudge against Macedon, agreed to fight Philip on land while a small Roman naval squadron operated along the western Greek coast. The idea was simple: tie Philip down in Greece so he could never send meaningful help to Hannibal. It worked, but only barely, and only at enormous cost to Rome's Greek allies. The Aetolians did most of the actual fighting, and most of the actual dying. Philip's forces raided their territory, burned their towns, and sold their populations into slavery. When the Aetolians eventually realized that Rome was using them as a buffer and had no intention of committing a full army to Greece, they made a separate peace with Philip. Rome, still focused on finishing Hannibal, accepted a general settlement shortly after. The Peace of Phenice formally ended the First Macedonian War and left Philip's kingdom intact. From Philip's perspective, he had survived. He had fought Rome to a draw, kept his kingdom, and emerged from the war with his army and his ambitions largely undamaged. He looked south toward the weakened Greek city-states and east toward the crumbling edges of the Seleucid Empire and saw room to expand. What he did not see, what he could not yet understand, was that Rome never forgot a threat, and Rome never accepted a draw as a final outcome. The machine was already turning, and it was pointed directly at him. Philip wasted no time. With Rome distracted, and this is where Philip made his critical miscalculation. He assumed Rome was exhausted. He assumed that a republic that had just spent nearly 2 decades fighting Hannibal across Italy, Spain, and North Africa would have no appetite for another major war overseas. He assumed that the Adriatic was wide enough to keep Roman attention focused westward. On every count, he was wrong. The smaller Greek states that Philip was swallowing up did exactly what smaller states have always done when faced with a predator they cannot fight alone. They sent ambassadors to Rome, Rhodes, Pergamum, Athens. One after another, delegations arrived in the Roman Senate describing Philip's aggression in urgent terms, requesting intervention, offering alliance. The Senate listened, and what the senators heard confirmed something they had feared since Philip first allied with Hannibal years earlier. Macedon was not going to remain a distant problem. If Philip consolidated control of the Aegean, if he absorbed the wealth of the Greek coastal cities and gained control of the eastern trade routes, he would become strong enough to threaten Roman interests directly. perhaps even strong enough to try crossing the Adriatic again, this time with far greater resources. The Roman Senate voted for war. The Second Macedonian War began, and this time Rome was not going to fight it with a skeleton naval force and borrowed allies. This time, legions were crossing the Adriatic, but here is where the reality of Roman military operations starts to matter more than Roman intentions. Declaring war on Macedon was one thing. Actually projecting military force across the Adriatic into the mountainous interior of Greece against a professional Macedonian army operating on home ground, that was an entirely different problem. And in the opening phase of this war, Rome struggled badly. The first Roman commander sent to Greece was Publius Sulpicius Galba, and his campaign accomplished almost nothing of strategic value. He landed on the western Greek coast with 2 legions and attempted to push inland toward Macedon, but the terrain was against him from the start. Western Greece is not flat farmland. It is a wall of mountain ranges, narrow passes, river gorges, and forested ridgelines that favour the defender at every turn. Philip knew this ground intimately. He positioned blocking forces in the passes, harassed Roman supply columns, and refused to offer the kind of pitched battle that Roman legions were designed to win. Galba spent an entire campaigning season marching, counter-marching, and achieving very little. His troops suffered from poor supply, difficult terrain, and constant skirmishing with Macedonian light troops, who knew every goat track in the hills. The following year a new commander arrived, Publius Villius Tapulus, and the pattern repeated. More marching, more inconclusive skirmishing in the western mountains, no decisive engagement. Philip continued to hold the passes and avoid a major battle on Roman terms. The Macedonian strategy was simple and effective. Let the mountains do the work, keep the Romans pinned on the western side of the Greek peninsula, and wait for Roman public patience to run out, just as it had during the First War. Here is the thing. This strategy nearly worked. The Roman Senate was receiving reports of 2 consecutive years of indecisive campaigning, rising costs, and no clear progress. There were voices in Rome questioning whether this war was worth fighting at all. The legions that had been sent to Greece were needed elsewhere. Roman citizens were tired of endless military service after the long nightmare of the Hannibalic War. If Philip could hold out for 1 or 2 more campaigning seasons, there was a real chance the Senate would seek terms, just as it had before. What changed everything was a single appointment. The Senate sent Titus Quinctius Flamininus to take command in Greece, and Flamininus was a different kind of Roman general. He was young, barely 30 years old, politically ambitious, fluent in Greek, and possessed of a strategic imagination that his predecessors had lacked. Where Galba and Villius had battered themselves against Philip's mountain defences like men trying to walk through a wall, Flamininus immediately looked for a way around. He understood that the war would not be won by forcing the western passes. Flamininus began a diplomatic campaign that ran parallel to his military one. He sent envoys to the Achaean League in the Peloponnese, which had been allied with Macedon for years. He made contact with dissident factions inside Thessaly. He offered terms that sounded remarkably generous. Rome, he declared, had not come to Greece to conquer. Rome had come to liberate the Greeks from Macedonian domination. Now, whether Flamininus actually believed this, or whether it was purely a strategic maneuver, has been debated by historians for 2,000 years. But what matters for this story is that it worked. The Achaean League switched sides. Several Thessalian cities opened their gates. Philip's defensive network in central Greece began to collapse, not because the Romans had broken it by force, but because Flamininus had convinced enough Greeks that siding with Rome was safer than siding with Macedon. And that opened the door to the battle Philip had spent 2 years trying to avoid. With his alliance network crumbling and Roman forces now able to move through central Greece, Philip was forced to concentrate his army and fight. The 2 forces met at Cynocephali, a line of low, rocky hills in Thessaly in the early summer. The engagement began almost by accident. Advance parties from both armies stumbled into each other on the ridgeline in thick morning fog. Skirmishing escalated. Both commanders committed reinforcements, and within hours the full strength of both armies was engaged on broken, hilly ground that neither side had chosen. This was exactly the wrong terrain for a Macedonian phalanx. The Sarissa formation needed flat, open ground to maintain its alignment. On the uneven ridges of Cynocephali, the phalanx could not keep its ranks dressed. Gaps appeared. Units advanced at different speeds depending on the slope they were climbing. The left wing of Philip's phalanx, which reached the crest first, actually drove the Roman left backward and inflicted serious casualties. For a few critical minutes, it looked like Macedonian discipline would carry the day. But the Roman right wing, advancing up the opposite slope, hit the Macedonian left before it had fully formed. The legionaries did not try to push through the wall of sarissa points. Instead, they worked into the gaps between phalanx units that the rough terrain had created, got inside the reach of the long pikes, and began cutting men down with their short swords at close quarters. Once Roman soldiers were inside the sarissa line, the Macedonian pikemen were nearly helpless. The sarissa was useless at arm's length. The pikemen carried only a small secondary knife. They had no training and no equipment for close-in fighting against men carrying heavy shields and short stabbing blades designed for exactly this kind of work. Then came the stroke that broke the battle open. A Roman military tribune, his name is not recorded, commanding a detachment on the right wing, made a decision on his own initiative without orders from Flamininus. He saw that the Macedonian left was collapsing, pulled 20 maniples out of the line, and led them around the back of the hill into the rear of Philip's advancing right wing. The Macedonian right, which had been winning its fight, suddenly found itself attacked from behind. The phalanx could not turn. The formation that was devastatingly effective in a frontal advance had almost no ability to pivot or reorient. Within minutes, the Macedonian right wing disintegrated. Philip's army broke and ran. 8,000 Macedonians were killed. 5,000 more were captured. Philip fled north with the remnants of his army. The Battle of Cynocephalae was over, and with it, Macedon's ability to project power across Greece. What had just happened was more than a tactical defeat. It was a demonstration of a fundamental mismatch between two military systems. The Macedonian phalanx was designed for one thing, the head-on collision on flat ground. When it got that fight, it was devastating. Philip's right wing had proven that at Cynocephalae it had pushed the Roman left back handily. But the moment conditions deviated from the ideal, broken terrain, gaps in the line, an unexpected flank attack, the phalanx had no answer. It could not adapt. It could not flex. It was rigid by design, and that rigidity became a death sentence the moment the battlefield stopped cooperating. The Roman legion, by contrast, was built for exactly this kind of disorder. The maniple system broke the legion into small, semi-independent tactical units that could move, turn, and fight on their own initiative. That unnamed tribune who swung 20 maniples into Philip's rear did not need to wait for orders from the commanding general. The Roman system expected and rewarded that kind of initiative at the unit level. The legion was not a single instrument. It was a collection of instruments, each capable of independent action, coordinated by training and discipline rather than rigid formation. This difference, flexibility against rigidity, would decide every major engagement between Roman and Greek forces for the next 2 decades, and after Cynocephalae it was no longer a theory. It was a demonstrated fact, paid for in Macedonian blood on the hills of Thessaly. Flamininus dictated terms. Philip was forced to withdraw from all of Greece. He surrendered his fleet. He paid a large war indemnity. His kingdom was reduced to Macedon proper, the old homeland, stripped of its Greek satellites and Aegean possessions. And then Flamininus did something that stunned the Greek world. At the Isthmian Games near Corinth, before a massive crowd of Greeks assembled from across the peninsula, a herald read out a proclamation. Rome declared that all Greek states formerly subject to Macedon were now free to govern themselves, free from tribute, free from foreign garrisons. The crowd erupted. Plutarch wrote that the cheering was so loud that birds flying overhead dropped from the sky. It was one of the most dramatic diplomatic moments in ancient history, and it was in many ways completely sincere. Flamininus genuinely withdrew Roman troops from Greece within a few years, leaving the Greek city-states to manage their own affairs. But it was also something else. It was a message to every king, every league, and every ambitious ruler in the Eastern Mediterranean. Rome was now the arbiter of Greek affairs. Rome decided who was free and who was not, and any power that challenged that arrangement would face what Philip had faced at Cynocephalae. Not everyone received that message the way Rome intended. Across the Aegean, in the sprawling territories of the Seleucid Empire, a king named Antiochus III was watching these events with very different conclusions and very dangerous ambitions. Antiochus III was not a minor king. he ruled the largest empire in the Mediterranean world, a vast domain stretching from the western coast of Asia Minor all the way to the borders of India. He commanded armies that dwarfed anything Macedon could field. His treasury was funded by the tax revenues of dozens of provinces across Mesopotamia, Persia and the Levant, and he had spent the previous 2 decades earning a title that no one gave him as flattery: Antiochus the Great. He had earned it. In a series of grueling campaigns across the eastern half of his empire, Antiochus had reasserted Seleucid control over territories that had broken away during decades of dynastic weakness. He had marched into Bactria, modern Afghanistan, and forced the breakaway Greek kingdom there back into a tributary relationship. He had pushed into the Indus Valley, echoing the campaigns of Alexander himself. He had crushed revolts in Media and Persia. He had fought the Ptolemaic Egyptians at the Battle of Panium near the headwaters of the Jordan River and seized control of the entire Levantine coast, including the wealthy trading ports of Phoenicia. By the time Rome was celebrating its victory over Philip at Cynocephali, Antiochus had reassembled more of Alexander's old empire than any ruler since Alexander's immediate successors. And now he was looking west. Antiochus saw the same map that every strategically minded ruler in the eastern Mediterranean could see. Macedon had just been humbled. The Greek city-states were technically free but disorganized and vulnerable. The Aegean was a power vacuum. And the western coast of Asia Minor, the wealthy Greek cities of Ionia, Aeolis, and the Hellespont, were there for the taking. These cities had been under Seleucid control generations earlier, before the dynasty lost its grip. Antiochus considered them his by right of inheritance. He began moving troops into the region, occupying cities, installing garrisons, and restoring Seleucid authority along the Aegean coast. This put him on a direct collision course with Rome. Several of those cities had been declared free in the settlement after the Roman Senate sent diplomatic missions to Antiochus, demanding that he withdraw from the Greek cities of Asia Minor and stay out of Europe. Antiochus, by all accounts, found these demands baffling. Who were the Romans to dictate terms to the heir of Alexander's empire? Rome had no historical claim to Asia Minor. Rome had no territory east of the Adriatic. In Antiochus's view, Rome was a Western power that had gotten lucky against a weakened Macedon, and its demands amounted to interference in affairs that were none of its business. What made the situation even more volatile was the man sitting in Antiochus's court as an honoured guest and military advisor, Hannibal Barca. After his defeat by Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama, Hannibal had been driven out of Carthage by political enemies and had made his way east, eventually finding refuge with Antiochus. The greatest enemy Rome had ever faced was now counselling the most powerful king in the eastern Mediterranean. Roman senators who learned of this arrangement were alarmed, and with good reason. Hannibal, according to later sources, urged Antiochus to take the war to Italy, to land an army on the Italian peninsula and force Rome to fight on its own soil, while Antiochus swept through Greece. It was a bold strategy, and if Antiochus had followed it, the war might have unfolded very differently. But Antiochus did not follow it. He did not trust Hannibal enough to give him an independent command, and he did not believe the war would be that difficult. He had spent 20 years winning campaigns across half of Asia. He had armies that numbered in the tens of thousands, including war elephants, heavy cavalry, and the formidable Seleucid phalanx, trained and equipped in the Macedonian tradition, but fielded on a much larger scale. Antiochus believed he could defeat Rome in Greece, on his own terms with his own generals. In the autumn, Antiochus crossed into Europe. He landed in Greece with an advance force of roughly 10,000 men, establishing himself at the port of Demetrius in Thessaly. He expected the Greek states to rally to him as a liberator, a king powerful enough to free them from Roman influence and restore Greek independence under Seleucid protection. The Aetolian League, still bitter about their treatment during the First Macedonian War and resentful of Rome's growing dominance, had invited him. They promised that all of Greece would rise once Antiochus arrived with his army. It did not happen. Most Greek states stayed neutral or sided quietly with Rome. Athens refused to join Antiochus. The Achaean League remained loyal to its Roman alliance. Even states that resented Roman influence were more afraid of inviting a Seleucid king into Greece than they were of tolerating Roman oversight. Antiochus found himself in Thessaly, with a force that was far too small for a major war, and far too isolated from his base of power in Asia. The Romans moved fast. A consular army under Manius Acilius Glabrio crossed the Adriatic and marched into central Greece, reinforced by allied Greek contingents. Antiochus, outnumbered and unable to draw more Greek states to his side, made his stand at the one place in Greece that had stopped an invading army before, the pass of Thermopylae. It was a choice loaded with historical symbolism. 3 centuries earlier, a small Greek force under the Spartan king Leonidas had held this narrow coastal pass against the entire Persian army of Xerxes. The pass was barely wide enough for a few men to walk abreast, pinched between the mountains and the sea. A small, well-positioned force could hold it against far superior numbers, or at least that was the theory. Antiochus fortified the pass, positioned his 10,000 troops behind a defensive wall, and prepared to hold the gateway to southern Greece. What happened next was almost a replay of the original battle, down to the critical detail. At Thermopylae in the Persian War, the Greek position had been turned when a local traitor showed the Persians a mountain path that bypassed the pass. Leonidas and his Spartans were surrounded and destroyed. Antiochus knew this history. He sent detachments to guard the mountain paths above the pass, specifically the same path called the Anapeia Trail that the Persians had used centuries before, but the detachments he sent were Aetolian troops. When Antiochus's troops in the main pass saw Roman soldiers appearing above and behind them on the mountain slopes, panic spread through the line. The Seleucid position collapsed in minutes. Antiochus's army disintegrated. The king himself barely escaped, fleeing to the coast with a handful of cavalry and taking ship back across the Aegean. He left behind his camp, his treasury, and most of his men, killed, captured, or scattered across the Greek countryside. Thermopylae was a humiliation, but it was not the decisive blow. Antiochus still had the full resources of his enormous empire behind him. His main army, the real army, the one with the heavy phalanx, the war elephants, the armoured cavalry, and the professional troops drawn from across Asia, was still intact, concentrated in Asia Minor. The force he had lost in Greece was an advance guard, not his full strength. Antiochus retreated to Sardis, the old Lydian capital in Western Asia Minor, and began assembling the largest army he had ever commanded. He was going to fight Rome again, but this time it would be on Asian soil, with every resource his empire could muster, and for the first time in its history a Roman army was going to cross into Asia. The command fell to Lucius Cornelius Scipio, the brother of Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. Africanus himself accompanied the expedition as a senior advisor, and everyone understood that the real strategic mind behind the campaign was his. The Scipio brothers gathered a force of roughly 30,000 men, crossed the Hellespont and marched into the interior of Asia Minor. It was the farthest any Roman army had ever operated from home. Their supply lines stretched back across the Aegean, through Greece, and across the Adriatic to Italy. Thousands of miles of sea and land that had to remain open for the army to survive. Antiochus chose his ground carefully. He positioned his army near the city of Magnesia, at the foot of Mount Sipylus in Western Asia Minor, on a broad, flat plain that was perfect for the Seleucid style of warfare. His force was enormous. Ancient sources put it at over 70,000 men, though modern historians generally scale that number down. Even at conservative estimates, Antiochus outnumbered the Romans by a significant margin. His battle line stretched for nearly 4 miles. On the wings, he deployed heavy armoured cavalry and war elephants. At the centre, he placed the core of Seleucid military power, the phalanx, 16,000 strong, armed with sarissa pikes and organised into blocks that echoed the Macedonian system at its peak. This was the army that had reconquered half of Asia. This was the army led by a king who had never lost a major campaign, and it was drawn up on exactly the kind of ground where the phalanx was supposed to be unbeatable. The Battle of Magnesia, fought in the winter, was the largest pitched battle between a Roman and a Hellenistic army that had yet occurred, and it exposed, on an even greater scale than Cynocephalae, the fatal weaknesses of the Greek way of war when matched against the Roman system. The battle opened well for Antiochus. On his right wing, the king personally led a cavalry charge that shattered the Roman left. His horsemen drove the Roman cavalry off the field entirely, and pursued them all the way back to the Roman camp. It was a spectacular tactical success, and it was completely irrelevant. Because while Antiochus was chasing routed cavalrymen miles from the battlefield, the centre and left of his army were being destroyed. The Roman legions advanced into the Seleucid phalanx, and once again, the same pattern from Cynocephalae repeated. The phalanx held on flat ground when its formation was intact, but the Romans did not simply charge into the wall of pikes. They used their light troops and allied cavalry on the left to stampede Antiochus's war elephants back into his own infantry, throwing the Seleucid left wing into disorder. Then the legions pushed forward into the gaps, got inside the Sarissa line, and began the close-quarters killing that the Macedonian-style phalanx simply could not survive. When Antiochus finally returned from his cavalry pursuit and saw the state of his battle line, it was over. The phalanx was broken, his left wing had collapsed, tens of thousands of his soldiers were dead, dying or fleeing east across the plain. Ancient sources report Seleucid losses of over 50,000 killed and captured. Roman losses were minimal, a few hundred dead at most. Magnesia was not just a defeat. It was the complete destruction of. He paid an indemnity so enormous that it crippled the Seleucid treasury for a generation. He surrendered his war elephants and most of his fleet. He was forbidden from ever again sending an army west of the Taurus, and he was required to hand over Hannibal, though Hannibal fled before the Romans could take him, eventually taking poison rather than falling into Roman hands. In the span of just a few years, Rome had defeated both of the great military powers of the Greek world, Macedon and the Seleucid Empire, says in back-to-back wars. The phalanx, the weapon that had dominated Mediterranean warfare for a century and a half, had been broken twice in major battles by the Roman legion. No Greek or Macedonian army would ever defeat Rome in a pitched engagement again. But conquering Greece was not the same as defeating Greek armies. Winning battles was the part Rome was good at. What came next? Managing the political wreckage of the Greek world, keeping dozens of fractious city-states in line, dealing with the resentments and ambitions that Roman power had created, that was going to be far more difficult, and it was going to lead to a final catastrophe that would burn one of the greatest cities in the ancient world to the ground. Rome had now humbled the two greatest powers in the eastern Mediterranean. Philip's Macedon had been stripped of its empire. Antiochus's Seleucid domain had been pushed behind the Taurus mountains. Roman legions had proven on two separate battlefields that the phalanx could be beaten, and yet Rome did something that surprised nearly everyone in the Greek world. It pulled back. After Magnesia, the Roman army withdrew from Asia Minor. After Cynocephalae, Roman troops had left Greece within a few years. The Senate did not annex territory. It did not install permanent garrisons. It did not impose governors or create provinces in the Greek East. Instead, Rome handed the captured Seleucid territories in Asia Minor to its allies, Pergamum and Rhodes, and left the Greek city-states to manage themselves under the general understanding that they would remain friendly to Roman interests. This was not generosity, it was policy. The Roman Senate in this period had no desire to govern the Greek world directly. Governing distant territories required permanent armies, long-term funding, and administrative infrastructure that the Republic was not yet built to provide. Rome's system of annual magistracies, consuls serving one-year terms, governors rotating in and out, was designed for Italy and its immediate surroundings, not for managing an empire spanning the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Senate preferred a cheaper model, Greek freedom under Roman supervision. The Greeks would govern themselves, settle their own disputes, and manage their own affairs. Rome would intervene only when its interests were threatened. The problem with this model was that it satisfied almost no one. The Greek states that had sided with Rome expected rewards: territory, favourable trade terms, protection from their neighbours. When those rewards were slow in coming or smaller than expected, resentment built. The Greek states that had sided against Rome, or that had tried to stay neutral, lived in constant anxiety about Roman punishment. Every diplomatic slight, every unfavourable ruling by a Roman commission, every perceived act of favouritism toward a rival city fed into a growing conviction that Roman freedom was not really freedom at all. It was subjugation dressed in polite language. And nowhere was this tension more dangerous than in Macedon itself. Philip V had accepted his defeat at Cynocephalae with a discipline that surprised the Romans. He paid his war indemnity. He surrendered his fleet. He withdrew from Greece as required. And then, quietly, methodically, over the next 15 years, he began rebuilding. He could not rebuild his army to its former size. The peace terms set limits on his military forces, but he could strengthen his kingdom internally. He reorganized Macedon's finances, opened new silver mines in Thrace, resettled depopulated areas with new colonists and stockpiled resources. He did not violate the letter of his treaty with Rome, but everyone understood what he was doing. And this message found a receptive audience because by this point, Roman behaviour in Greece had created exactly the kind of resentment that Perseus could exploit. Roman diplomatic commissions had been intervening in Greek affairs with increasing heaviness. Disputes between Greek states that had once been settled locally were now being referred to Rome. Roman envoys made demands. Roman senators expected deference. Greek politicians who cooperated too closely with Rome were seen by their own people as collaborators. Greek politicians who resisted Roman pressure were seen by Rome as potential threats. The system Flaminius had created, Greek freedom under Roman oversight, was generating friction at every level, and that friction was pushing the Greek world toward another war. The trigger came through a combination of Roman suspicion and Greek desperation. Eumenes II, king of Pergamum and Rome's closest ally in the east, travelled to Rome to warn the Senate about Perseus. He described Macedonian military preparations, diplomatic contacts with anti-Roman factions in Greece, and alleged secret negotiations with the Seleucid Empire. On his way home from Rome, Eumenes was nearly killed in an ambush near the sacred site of Delphi. Rocks were rolled down a mountainside onto his party as they travelled a narrow path. Eumenes survived but was badly injured. Rome blamed Perseus. Whether Perseus actually ordered the assassination attempt has never been proven. But it did not matter. The Roman Senate had already decided that Macedon under Perseus represented a threat that could not be tolerated. The pattern was the same as before, a Macedonian king growing too strong, building alliances among discontented Greeks, and positioning himself to challenge Roman authority. The Senate voted for war. The Third Macedonian War began, and this time Rome intended to settle the Macedonian question permanently. But the opening of this war revealed something uncomfortable about the Roman military system, something that the victories at Cynocephalae and Magnesia had masked. Roman armies were not always well led. The system of rotating annual commands meant that military competence at the top was essentially random. A consul who happened to be a gifted field commander might be followed the next year by one who was a talented politician but a mediocre general, and in the first 2 years of the Third Macedonian War, Rome sent exactly the wrong commanders. The first Roman army to enter Macedon was led by Publius Licinius Crassus, and his campaign was a disaster. He marched his legions into the hill country of northern Thessaly, where Perseus was waiting with a well-prepared army on ground of his own choosing. Near the town of Callinicus, Perseus's cavalry, Macedonian heavy horse supported by allied Thracian riders, caught the Roman cavalry in the open and routed them completely. Roman horsemen fled the field in panic. The infantry was forced to retreat. It was the first significant Macedonian victory over a Roman force in a generation, and its psychological impact was enormous. Across Greece, the news of Callinicus sent shockwaves. States that had been quietly sympathetic to Perseus, but afraid to act openly, now began to waver. The Epirot League, which controlled territory along Rome's main supply route from the Adriatic coast, split into pro-Roman and pro-Macedonian factions. Delegations from Greek cities that had been reliably pro-Roman began hedging their commitments. The entire Roman alliance network in Greece, the network that had taken decades to build through diplomacy, intimidation, and the memory of Cynocephalae, was suddenly trembling. Perseus, for his part, failed to capitalize on the victory. After Callinicus, he had a window of opportunity to press his advantage, rally the wavering Greek states to his side, and force the Romans into a strategic retreat. Instead, he offered peace negotiations. He sent envoys to the Roman commander proposing a return to the status quo. He offered to pay an indemnity. He practically begged for terms. The Romans refused. They were never going to accept a negotiated settlement after a battlefield humiliation. The Senate sent more troops, and eventually a new commander. But the second year of the war went no better than the first. The replacement consul, Aulus Hostilius Mancinus, proved even less competent than Crassus. He attempted to force the passes into Macedon through the Vale of Tempe, the narrow gorge between Mount Olympus and Mount Ossa that served as the traditional gateway from Thessaly into the Macedonian heartland. Perseus had fortified this route heavily. 2 full years of war, and Rome had achieved nothing. The great military machine that had crushed Hannibal, shattered Philip at Cynocephalae, and annihilated Antiochus at Magnesia could not even get into Macedon. Perseus held every pass, every river crossing, every defensible position on the frontier. His treasury was still full, his army was intact and confident after its cavalry victory at Callinicus. And the longer the war dragged on, the more likely it became that the Greek state sitting on the fence would tip toward Macedon. This was the pattern that had defined every Roman war in Greece. Not immediate, overwhelming victory, but a grinding opening phase of frustration, setback, and near failure, followed by adaptation. Rome's great advantage was never that it got things right the first time. Its advantage was that it had the manpower, the wealth, and the political will to keep trying until it found the right commander and the right approach. Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, every Greek power that fought Rome, they had to win the first round decisively, or they would eventually face a Rome that had learned from its mistakes. And now, Rome was about to learn from its mistakes one final time. The Senate turned to Lucius Aemilius Paulus. He was 60 years old, a former consul who had fought campaigns in Spain and Liguria, a man known for strict discipline, careful logistics, and above all, patience. He was not flashy. He was not young and ambitious like Flamininus. He was a methodical professional who understood that wars were won by preparation and supply, as much as by battlefield courage. Paulus arrived in Greece and immediately addressed the problems that had crippled his predecessors. He tightened discipline in the legions, which had grown slack after 2 years of inactivity. He reorganized the supply system, ensuring that his army would not run short of grain or equipment during a prolonged campaign. And then he did something that showed real, operational imagination. Instead of hammering at the fortified passes that Perseus had been defending successfully for 2 years, Paulus sent a flanking force, a strong detachment of over 8,000 men, on a wide march through the mountains south of Olympus, through terrain so rough that Perseus had not bothered to fortify it, because he considered it impassable for a major military force. The detachment, led by Scipio Nasica, spent days picking their way through mountain trails, moving at night to avoid detection. When they emerged behind Perseus's defensive line, the entire Macedonian position along the frontier unravelled. Perseus could not hold the passes and simultaneously defend against a force in his rear. He was forced to abandon his fortifications and fall back into the Macedonian interior, consolidating his army for a pitched battle that he had successfully avoided for 2 years. The two armies met at Pydna, on the coastal plain south of Mount Olympus, and we are back where we began. The plain at Pydna was exactly the kind of ground Perseus wanted. It was flat, open, and wide enough for the Macedonian phalanx to deploy in its full formation without obstruction. No broken ridgelines like Cynocephalae, no fog, no accidental collisions on hilltops. This was going to be the battle the Macedonians had been trained for, the straight head-on collision that the phalanx was designed to win. Perseus assembled his army with care. The phalanx formed the centre, roughly 20,000 men arranged in their traditional deep formation, sarissa pikes levelled, shields locked. On the wings, he placed his cavalry and light infantry, including Thracian allies whose reputation for ferocity in close combat was well established. The total Macedonian force numbered somewhere around 40,000. Perseus had every reason to believe that on this ground, with this army, in this formation, he could break the Roman legions the way Macedonian phalanxes had broken every enemy they had faced on flat terrain for 150 years. Paulus, watching from across the plain, knew exactly what he was facing. He had studied the reports from Cynocephalae and Magnesia. He understood the phalanx, its devastating frontal power, and its critical vulnerabilities. But understanding a thing and experiencing it were different matters entirely. When the Macedonian phalanx began its advance, with the sarissa points catching the afternoon light and the ground trembling under the synchronized march of 20,000 men, Paulus later admitted that the sight shook him in a way no battlefield experience had prepared him for. The initial collision went badly for Rome. The phalanx hit the Roman centre and drove it backward. Legionaries who tried to get past the sarissa points were skewered before they could close the distance. The front ranks of the Roman line buckled, men fell, units gave ground. For several terrible minutes the phalanx was doing exactly what it was built to do, grinding forward through the Roman formation like a machine, unstoppable as long as its alignment held. Here is what saved the Roman army. The plain at Pydna was flat, but it was not perfectly flat. As the phalanx advanced and the Romans retreated, the ground began to change subtly. Small ditches, shallow rises, patches of uneven footing, insignificant obstacles on any normal march, but devastating to a formation that required every man in 16 ranks to maintain exact spacing with the men beside him and in front of him. The phalanx began to develop gaps, not large ones, not immediately visible from a distance, but gaps nonetheless, places where a few feet of space opened between one section of the line and the next as men stumbled, adjusted their footing, or fell slightly out of step. Paulus saw it. More importantly, his centurions and tribunes saw it. And this is where the Roman system proved its decisive advantage, not in any grand strategic concept, but in the tactical initiative of junior officers. Without waiting for orders from the commanding general, Roman centurions began directing their men into the gaps. Small groups of legionaries, sometimes just a handful of men, pushed through the openings in the Sarissa wall and got inside the formation. Once inside, the fight was no longer a battle, it was a slaughter. The Macedonian pikemen were virtually helpless at close quarters. The Sarissa was 18 feet long. It could not be shortened, reversed, or swung in a tight space. A pikeman who dropped his Sarissa had only a small dagger for defence. He wore lighter armour than a Roman legionary. He had no heavy shield. He was trained for the coordinated push of the phalanx, not for individual combat. The Roman legionary, by contrast, carried a large curved shield, wore segmented armour, and fought with a gladius, a short, heavy stabbing sword designed specifically for the close-in killing that happened when formations broke apart. The destruction rippled outward from every gap. As Roman soldiers got inside the phalanx at one point, the men around that breach had to turn to defend themselves, which opened more gaps, which let more Romans in. The entire formation began to collapse from within, like a wall with its mortar pulled out. Within less than an hour, the Macedonian phalanx, the most feared military formation in the ancient world, disintegrated. The killing was enormous. Ancient sources report that 20,000 Macedonians died at Pydna, most of them in the route that followed the collapse of the phalanx. 11,000 more were captured. The Macedonian army, the instrument that had carried Alexander to the Indus and his successors to dominance across the eastern Mediterranean, ceased to exist as a fighting force in a single afternoon. Perseus fled. He ran north, then east, eventually taking refuge on the island of Samothrace in the northern Aegean. He carried with him the royal treasury, or what was left of it. Even in flight, his legendary reluctance to spend money held. He had gone into the war with a treasury large enough to hire mercenaries, buy allies, and fund years of campaigning. He had spent almost none of it. He had haggled over payments to Thracian allies who might have tipped the balance. He had refused to fund a naval campaign that could have cut Roman supply lines across the Adriatic. He had pinched every coin while his kingdom's existence hung in the balance. Now he sat on Samothrace with his gold, a king without a kingdom, waiting for the Romans to come and take him. They did. Perseus was captured, brought to Rome, and paraded through the streets in Paulus's triumphal procession, the ultimate Roman ceremony of military victory. He was displayed in chains before the Roman public, along with his children, his courtiers, and wagon loads of Macedonian treasure. He spent the rest of his life as a prisoner in Italy, dying in captivity a few years later. The dynasty that traced its lineage to the companions of Alexander the Great ended in a Roman jail. But Paulus and the Senate did not simply defeat Macedon this time. They dismantled it. The kingdom was abolished entirely. There would be no more Macedonian kings. The territory was divided into 4 separate republics, each forbidden from having political or economic contact with the others. Macedonians from one republic could not marry citizens of another. They could not buy property across republican lines. They could not trade timber or salt, key Macedonian exports, without Roman permission. The silver mines that had funded Macedonian military power for generations were shut down entirely for the first decade, then reopened under strict Roman oversight, with production capped at half their previous output. The message was unmistakable. Rome was not going to repeat the mistake it had made after Cynocephaly. After the Second Macedonian War, Rome had left Philip with his kingdom intact, trusting that a weakened Macedon would remain compliant. That trust had produced a 15-year arms build-up and a third war that cost Rome years of frustration and thousands of casualties before Pydna finally settled it. The Senate would not make that mistake again. Macedon as a political entity was erased from the map, And Rome did not stop with Macedon. In the aftermath of Pydna, the Senate turned its attention to every Greek state that had wavered during the war, every city, every league, every faction that had hedged its bets or shown sympathy toward Perseus. The reckoning was systematic and ruthless. Epirus, the region along the Adriatic coast whose leaders had split between Rome and Macedon during the war, received the harshest punishment. Paulus was ordered by the Senate to make an example. His legions marched through Epirus and, in a single coordinated operation, sacked 70 towns in a single day. The timing was deliberate. All 70 towns were hit simultaneously so that none could send warning to the others. 150,000 Epirates were enslaved. The region, which had been a significant power in western Greece for centuries, was reduced to a depopulated wasteland. It would not recover for generations. Across the rest of Greece, the purge was political rather than military, but no less devastating to the Greek political class. Rome demanded that the Achaean League, its own ally, the league that had sided with Rome in every war since Cynoscephalae, hand over 1,000 of its leading citizens for investigation on suspicion of disloyalty during the Third Macedonian War. These were not convicted criminals. They were not men who had fought against Rome. They were politicians, intellectuals, and civic leaders whose only offence was that they had not been enthusiastic enough in their support during the conflict. Among them was the historian Polybius, who would spend the next 16 years as a detainee in Italy, years he used to write the most important surviving account of Rome's rise to Mediterranean dominance. 1,000 men removed from their homes shipped to Italy, held without trial for over a decade. Most of them died in detention before the Senate finally released the survivors. And these were men from an allied state, a league that had fought alongside Rome. The message to the rest of Greece was devastating in its clarity. Friendship with Rome did not protect you. Loyalty to Rome did not protect you. Nothing protected you except absolute, unquestioning compliance. And even that might not be enough. The Greek world after Pydna was a changed place. The great powers that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for 2 centuries, Macedon and the Seleucid Empire, broken. The Greek city-states and leagues that survived were technically still free, still self-governing, still conducting their own affairs. But everyone understood the reality. Rome was the supreme authority. Roman commissions settled disputes. Roman envoys delivered instructions. Roman displeasure meant economic ruin or military devastation. The freedom that Flamininus had proclaimed at the Isthmian Games a generation earlier had become a polite fiction maintained by everyone because acknowledging the truth was too humiliating. But humiliation does not kill resistance. Sometimes it feeds it. And in the years after Pydna, as Rome's grip on Greece tightened and Roman arrogance grew more open, the pressure building inside the Greek world was approaching a point that no amount of diplomatic management could contain. The final explosion was coming, and when it arrived, it would end with fire. The 2 decades after Pydna were a slow suffocation. Greece was free in name and captive in practice. Roman commissions arrived regularly to adjudicate disputes between Greek states, and their rulings increasingly favoured whichever side was more useful to Roman interests at that moment. Greek politicians learned to calibrate every public statement, every diplomatic gesture, every vote in their assemblies to the question of how Rome would react. The political life of the Greek city-states, once defined by fierce independence, open debate, and jealously guarded sovereignty, became an exercise in managed compliance. The Achaean League felt this more than anyone. The League was the most powerful political organisation left in southern Greece, a confederation of city-states across the Peloponnese that included Corinth, Argos, Megalopolis, and dozens of smaller communities. It had been Rome's loyal ally for decades. Its leaders had fought alongside Roman armies, its citizens had bled for the Roman cause, and none of that mattered when the League's interest collided with Roman preferences. The central grievance was Sparta. The Spartans had been forcibly incorporated into the Achaean League years earlier, and they hated it. Sparta had its own traditions, its own identity, and a deep institutional resistance to being governed by a confederation it considered inferior. Spartan factions repeatedly petitioned Rome for independence from the League, and Rome, rather than supporting its Achaean allies, kept the question open, sometimes ruling in Sparta's favour, sometimes in the League's, always ensuring that the dispute remained unresolved and that both sides continued to depend on Roman arbitration. This was deliberate. A unified, confident Achaean league was not in Rome's interest. A league constantly distracted by internal disputes, constantly looking to Rome to settle its problems, constantly reminded of its dependence on Roman goodwill, that was far more manageable. The Senate had learned from Philip and Perseus that strong, unified Greek states eventually became threats. Keeping Greece divided and anxious was not a side effect of Roman policy, it was the policy, but the strategy had a cost. Every year that Rome manipulated Greek politics, every ruling that overrode Achaean sovereignty, every demand that Greek leaders comply with decisions made in a distant Senate chamber by men who had never set foot in the Peloponnese, all of it eroded the legitimacy of the pro-Roman faction within the League. Greek politicians who had built their careers on cooperation with Rome found themselves increasingly unable to defend that position to their own citizens. The argument that Roman friendship brought security and prosperity was wearing thin. What it brought, visibly and undeniably, was humiliation. The generation of Greek leaders who had lived through Cynoscephaly and Pydna, men who remembered the terror of facing Roman legions and understood viscerally what defiance would cost, was dying off. The new generation had not seen a Roman army in action. They had grown up in a Greece that was prosperous, culturally vibrant and resentful. They knew Rome was powerful, but they had not personally experienced that power on a battlefield, and some of them were beginning to believe that Roman dominance could be challenged. Not defeated, perhaps, but resisted, pushed back, tested. The crisis that finally broke the system open began, like so many crises in Greek history, with Sparta. The Spartans once again demanded separation from the Achaean League and appealed to Rome. The Senate sent a commission to Greece to investigate. The commissioners arrived and delivered a ruling that stunned the League. Not only would Sparta be separated from the Achaean Confederation, but several other cities, Corinth, Argos, and Heraclea among them, would also be detached. The League was to be dismembered. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. In the assembly halls of the Achaean cities, the announcement provoked outrage that crossed factional lines. Even politicians who had spent their careers as reliable Roman allies were appalled. The man who channeled this fury into action was Critolaus, the newly elected strategos, the chief magistrate and military commandant of the Achaean League. Critolaus was part of the new generation. He was a fiery orator, a committed Greek nationalist, and a man who believed that the Achaean League had been grovelling before Rome for too long. When the Roman commissioners attempted to address the Achaean assembly directly, Critolaus organised a boycott. The assembly refused to hear them. The commissioners were sent away without a response. This was an act of open defiance, and Critolaus knew it. He followed it with something even more dangerous. He began touring the Peloponnesian cities, giving speeches that attacked Roman arrogance and called for Greek unity against foreign domination. He forged an alliance with the Boeotian League in central Greece and with the city of Chalcis on the island of Euboea. He freed slaves and enrolled them in the army. He imposed emergency war taxes. He was preparing, openly and deliberately, for war with Rome. The Roman Senate sent one final diplomatic mission, led by Sextus Julius Caesar, to demand that the Achaeans stand down, accept the Senate's rulings, and release the cities Rome had ordered detached from the League. The embassy arrived at an Achaean assembly that was packed with Critolaus's supporters. When the Roman terms were read out, the crowd jeered. Sextus Julius Caesar was shouted down. According to one account, members of the assembly threatened the Roman envoys physically, and the delegation had to be escorted out under guard. There was no going back now. The Achaean League had publicly humiliated a Roman embassy, rejected the Senate's authority, and begun arming for war. For Rome, this was not merely a diplomatic insult. It was an existential challenge to the entire system of indirect control that had governed the Greek world since Cynoscephaly. If the Achaeans could defy Rome and survive, every dissatisfied Greek state would take note. The whole structure of Roman dominance in the East, built on the assumption that no Greek power would dare resist, would be undermined. The Senate's response was not immediate. Rome was simultaneously dealing with the final stages of the Third Punic War against Carthage, which was consuming significant military resources in North Africa. But the Senate found the forces. A Roman army under the praetor Quintus Caecilius Metellus was already stationed in Macedon, dealing with a recent uprising there. Metellus was ordered south into Greece to deal with the Achaean rebellion. Metellus moved quickly. He marched his legions through Thessaly and into central Greece, heading for the Achaean positions near the town of Scarpheia, close to Thermopylae. Critolaus had marched north with the Achaean army to link up with his Boeotian allies and establish a defensive position in central Greece, a strategy that made geographical sense but wildly overestimated the military capacity of his forces. The Achaean army was not a Roman army. It was not even a Macedonian army. It was a citizen militia, hastily expanded with freed slaves and poorly trained volunteers, led by officers whose military experience was limited to small-scale border skirmishes and policing actions. These men had never faced Roman legions. They had never experienced the disciplined, relentless Roman advance, the coordinated volley of heavy javelins followed by the controlled charge of armoured infantry fighting with short swords at close range. They had heard about it. They had not lived it. The engagement at Scarpheia was not a battle. It was a rout. Metellus's legions hit the Achaean army and broke it almost immediately. The citizen soldiers, encountering the reality of Roman military power for the first time, collapsed. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Units disintegrated before they were even engaged. Critolaus himself disappeared during the battle, killed, captured, or drowned attempting to flee. His body was never found. The Achaean army effectively ceased to exist at Scarpheia. But the war was not over. The League did not surrender. Instead, the Achaeans elected a new strategos, a man named Diaeus, and attempted to raise another army. Diaeus scraped together what forces he could, freeing more slaves, arming anyone who could hold a weapon, and pulling the remnants of the Achaean military into a last defensive position. And the place he chose to make his stand was the city that had always been the jewel of the Achaean League, the richest and most strategically important city in southern Greece. Corinth. Corinth was not just any Greek city. It occupied one of the most strategically valuable positions in the entire Mediterranean world. The city sat on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to central Greece, a strip of land barely 4 miles wide that controlled all land traffic between northern and southern Greece. Whoever held Corinth held the bridge between the two halves of the Greek peninsula. But Corinth's importance went far beyond geography. The city had 2 harbours. Lycaeum on the Corinthian Gulf faced west toward Italy and Sicily. Century on the Saronic Gulf faced east toward the Aegean, Asia Minor, and the trading networks of the eastern Mediterranean. Goods arriving from the east could be unloaded at Centuriae, hauled across the narrow isthmus on a paved trackway called the Diolkos, and loaded onto ships at Lycaeum for transport west, avoiding the long and dangerous sea voyage around the southern tip of the Peloponnese. This made Corinth one of the great commercial crossroads of the ancient world. Its markets handled goods from Egypt, Phoenicia, the Black Sea, Italy, and North Africa. Its wealth was legendary. Its population was enormous by Greek standards. Estimates range from 50,000 to 90,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Greece. Corinth was also a city of extraordinary cultural significance. The Isthmian Games, one of the 4 great Panhellenic athletic festivals, were held just outside its walls. It was at these games that Flamininus had proclaimed Greek freedom a generation earlier. The city's temples, public buildings, and works of art were famous throughout the Mediterranean. Greek writers described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Its bronze-working industry produced luxury goods that were prized from Spain to Syria. Its painted pottery had been exported across the Mediterranean for centuries. This was the city where Diaeus chose to make his last stand. And this was the city that Rome was about to destroy. The command of the Roman forces had now passed from Metellus to a new general. The Senate had dispatched Lucius Mummius, a consul, to take charge of the campaign and finish the Achaean War. Mummius was not a distinguished commander. He came from a relatively obscure family and had no reputation for strategic brilliance. But he was competent, methodical, and he had been given overwhelming force, a full consular army supplemented by allied contingents, totaling somewhere around 30,000 trained soldiers. Mummius marched south through central Greece, collecting Metellus's forces along the way, and advanced toward the isthmus of Corinth. Diaeus had positioned the remnants of the Achaean army on the isthmus itself, attempting to use the narrow terrain to offset his enormous disadvantage in numbers and quality. His forces were a patchwork. Survivors of Scarpheia, newly freed slaves with minimal training, volunteers from Achaean cities who knew they were fighting for the survival of their league, and a small number of experienced soldiers who understood exactly how desperate the situation was. The Battle of Corinth, or more accurately the Battle of the Isthmus, was fought in the early autumn. Dias led his forces out to meet Mummius on the approaches to the isthmus, choosing to fight in the open rather than shelter behind Corinth's walls. It was a decision born of desperation rather than tactical logic. Corinth's fortifications were strong, but a siege would only delay the inevitable. The Achaeans had no relief force coming, no allies left to call on, and no prospect of outlasting a Roman army that could be supplied by sea from both sides of the isthmus. The engagement was brief and one-sided. The Achaean cavalry, which was the best unit Dias had, actually performed well in the opening phase. They charged the Roman horse and drove them back in a sharp skirmish that briefly raised Achaean hopes. But when the Roman infantry advanced, the result was the same as Scarpheia. The Achaean foot soldiers, outmatched in training, equipment, discipline, and numbers, broke under the legionary assault. The rout was total. Dias fled back to Corinth, then continued south toward his home city of Megalopolis, where he poisoned his own family and then himself rather than face capture. Mummius advanced to the walls of Corinth. The city was in chaos. Thousands of Achaean soldiers had fled through it during the rout, spreading panic. Many of Corinth's own citizens had already begun to flee, streaming out of the southern gates toward the Peloponnesian interior with whatever possessions they could carry. Those who remained, the poor, the elderly, the enslaved, those who had nowhere to go or no means to travel, huddled in their homes and waited. Mummius waited 3 days before entering the city. Ancient sources differ on why. Some suggest he feared an ambush or a last desperate defense inside the streets. Others suggest he was waiting for orders from the Senate or for his forces to consolidate. Whatever the reason, when the Roman army finally entered Corinth, they found a city that had been partially abandoned but was still full of people and still full of the accumulated wealth of centuries. What happened next became one of the most infamous acts of destruction in ancient history. Mummius gave the order to sack the city. Roman soldiers moved through Corinth systematically. The male population of military age was killed. The women and children were enslaved. Tens of thousands of people sold into bondage in a single operation. The city's vast wealth was seized. Warehouses full of trade goods, private homes filled with generations of accumulated luxury, temple treasuries containing dedications from across the Greek world, all of it was claimed as Roman plunder. And then the art. Corinth was filled with masterworks of Greek painting, sculpture, and decorative craft accumulated over centuries. Statues by celebrated Greek sculptors, painted panels, bronze vessels of extraordinary quality. These were loaded onto wagons and shipped to Rome. Mummius himself, by most accounts, had little personal appreciation for Greek art. A famous story, likely embellished but widely repeated in antiquity, claimed that Mummius warned the contractors transporting Greek paintings to Rome that if any were damaged, they would have to replace them, as if masterpieces by Greek artists were interchangeable goods that could be reordered. But the sacking was not the end. After the plunder was removed, Mummius gave a second order. Corinth was to be burned. The city was put to the torch. Systematically, deliberately, completely. Temples, public buildings, private homes, workshops, markets. Everything that could burn was set alight. The fires consumed one of the oldest and wealthiest cities in the Greek world. Structures that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened rubble. The heat was so intense that archaeological excavations 2,000 years later found layers of roof tiles fused together with melted bronze and charred timber, compressed into solid masses of destruction debris. When the fires died, Mummius ordered the walls demolished. What remained of Corinth's fortifications was pulled down stone by stone. The city was not merely defeated, it was erased. The site was declared cursed ground. No one was permitted to rebuild or resettle it. Corinth would remain an uninhabited ruin for a full century, until Julius Caesar finally ordered its refoundation as a Roman colony. The destruction of Corinth was not an act of battlefield necessity. It was a calculated political statement, and it was delivered in the same year that Rome destroyed another great city on the opposite side of the Mediterranean, Carthage. In the same season that Scipio Aemilianus was burning Carthage to the ground in North Africa, Mummius was burning Corinth in Greece. The two destructions, occurring almost simultaneously, sent a single unified message to every power in the known world. Rome would tolerate no resistance. Rome would tolerate no defiance. Cities that challenged Roman authority would not simply be defeated. They would be annihilated so completely that their very existence would be erased from the landscape. The effect on the Greek world was exactly what the Senate intended. Resistance collapsed everywhere. The Achaean League was dissolved. The Boeotian League was dissolved. Greek cities that had participated in the revolt, or sympathized with it, or failed to actively support Rome during the crisis, were punished with fines, confiscations, and political restructuring. Greece was placed under the direct supervision of the Roman governor of Macedonia. The polite fiction of Greek freedom, the freedom Flamininus had proclaimed to thunderous cheering at the Isthmian Games, was finally abandoned. Greece was now a Roman subject territory, administered by Roman officials, taxed by Roman collectors, and garrisoned by Roman soldiers. The conquest was complete. A civilization that had shaped the intellectual, artistic, and political foundations of the Mediterranean world for half a millennium was now a province. Greek philosophers still taught. Greek artists still created. Greek language and culture would. In that time, Rome had fought 4 wars in Greece, destroyed 2 great kingdoms, shattered the phalanx as a viable military system, and dismantled the entire Greek state structure. The question that remains, the question that matters for anyone trying to understand how great powers rise and fall, is why? Why did Rome win? And why did Greece, with all its wealth, its military tradition, its cultural sophistication, and its strategic advantages, lose so completely? The answer is not simple, but it begins with something that happened long before the first Roman soldier set foot on Greek soil. The answer begins with how Rome built its army and how Greece built its armies, because the difference between those 2 systems determined everything that followed. Every battle, every campaign, every war. And the difference was not about courage or skill. Greek soldiers were brave. Macedonian pikemen were extraordinarily well drilled. Seleucid cavalry included some of the finest horsemen in the ancient world. The difference was about what happened after the first battle was over. The Macedonian military system and the broader Greek way of war that it represented was built around the decisive engagement. The phalanx existed to win a single, catastrophic collision. You assembled your army, you marched to the battlefield, you formed your line, and you pushed. If your phalanx held its formation and your enemies broke, you won. The war was over, treaties were signed, territory changed hands, and everyone went home. This model had governed Greek warfare for centuries, going all the way back to the hoplite battles of the classical period, when city-states would settle their disputes in a single afternoon of organised killing on a flat plain between their territories. Alexander the Great elevated this system to its highest expression. He added heavy cavalry, siege engineers, and sophisticated combined arms tactics to the basic phalanx model. But the core logic remained the same: seek the decisive battle, win it through superior discipline and shock power, and collapse the enemy's political will in a single stroke. It worked against the Persians at Granicus, at Issus, at Gaugamela. It worked so spectacularly that for 150 years after Alexander's death, every major military power in the eastern Mediterranean organised its forces on the same principle. The Macedonian successor kingdoms, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, the Antigonids, all fielded armies built around the Sarissa phalanx, all trained for the same kind of battle, all operating under the same strategic assumption: get the big fight right and everything else follows. The Roman system started from a completely different assumption. Rome expected to lose battles. That sounds paradoxical for a state that built the largest empire in the ancient world, but it is the single most important fact about the Roman military system. Rome did not build its army to win every engagement. Rome built its army to survive losing engagements and keep fighting. This was not a theory. It was a lesson learned through generations of brutal experience on the Italian peninsula. Before Rome ever fought a Greek army, it had spent centuries fighting the Samnites, the Gauls, the Etruscans, and dozens of other Italian peoples in wars that were often grinding, multi-year campaigns with devastating setbacks. The Gauls sacked Rome itself around 390 before Christ. The Samnites inflicted humiliating defeats on Roman armies in the mountain passes of central Italy. These experiences taught Rome something that the Greek world never fully absorbed. Wars are not decided by single battles. Wars are decided by which side can sustain the effort longer. The manpower system that Rome developed to meet this challenge was unlike anything else in the ancient world. Roman citizenship carried a military obligation. Every male citizen of appropriate age and property was liable for military service, and Rome enforced this obligation rigorously. But Rome went further. Through its network of alliances with the other peoples of Italy, the so-called Italian allies, Rome could draw on a military manpower pool that dwarfed any single Greek kingdom. Modern estimates suggest that by the time of the wars against Macedon and the Seleucids, Rome and its Italian allies could mobilize somewhere between 700,000 and 750,000 men of military age. This is what made the disaster at Cannae so revealing. Hannibal destroyed a Roman army of roughly 80,000 men in a single battle, a catastrophe of a scale that would have ended most ancient states. Any Greek kingdom that lost 80,000 men in one afternoon would have been finished. It would have had no choice but to sue for peace, because the manpower simply did not exist to rebuild. Macedon's entire field army at Pydna was around 40,000 men. The Seleucid force at Magnesia, drawn from across a continent-spanning empire, was perhaps 70,000. Losing a force of that size would have been an extinction-level event for either kingdom. Rome lost 80,000 men at Cannae and kept fighting. Within 2 years, Rome had more legions in the field than it had before the battle. It drew on Italian allied manpower. It lowered property requirements for service. It armed slaves. It did whatever was necessary to put soldiers back in the field, because the system was designed to absorb exactly this kind of punishment. Hannibal won battle after battle in Italy for over a decade, and it did not matter, because Rome could replace its losses and Hannibal could not replace his. This same dynamic played out in every Roman war in Greece, though on a smaller scale. When Publius Sulpicius Galba failed in his campaign against Philip during the Second Macedonian War, Rome replaced him. When Publius Villius Tapulus failed the following year, Rome replaced him too. When Publius Licinius Crassus was humiliated by Perseus's cavalry at Callinicus during the Third Macedonian War, Rome absorbed the setback, sent reinforcements, and eventually sent Aemilius Paulus. Each failed commander represented a lost campaigning season, wasted resources, and Roman casualties. None of it mattered strategically, because Rome always had another army, another commander, and another year to try again. The Greek kingdoms could not do this. Macedon had a relatively small citizen population. Its army was drawn from a limited base of Macedonian freeholders, supplemented by mercenaries and allied contingents. A major defeat did not just cost soldiers, it cost the irreplaceable core of trained pikemen who took years to develop. After Cynocephalae, Philip lost 8,000 dead and 5,000 captured. Those 13,000 men represented a catastrophic percentage of Macedon's total military manpower. Philip could rebuild, and he did, but it took him 15 years. Rome could rebuild the same losses in months. The Seleucid Empire had a larger population base than Macedon, but faced its own version of the same problem. The Seleucid military elite, the Macedonian-descended settler communities who provided the phalanx infantry and heavy cavalry, were a minority ruling class spread thinly across an enormous, ethnically diverse empire. Antiochus could recruit large armies by drawing on the many peoples of his empire, which is why his force at Magnesia was so large and so diverse. But the quality of those troops varied enormously. The core phalanx was solid. The allied contingents from the empire's eastern provinces were often unreliable, and a catastrophic defeat like Magnesia did not just destroy the army. It shook the loyalty of subject peoples across the empire who had been held in line by the perception of Seleucid military dominance. After Magnesia, Seleucid authority in the eastern provinces began to disintegrate. Regions that had been reconquered by Antiochus during his Great Eastern campaigns broke away again. The empire that had taken Antiochus 20 years to reassemble began falling apart within a decade of his defeat. Rome did not have this problem. Roman authority in Italy did not depend on winning every war. It depended on the structure of the alliance system, a web of treaties, mutual obligations, and shared interests that held the Italian Confederation together through victory and defeat alike. When Rome lost at Cannae, most of its Italian allies stayed loyal. When Rome lost early campaigns in Greece, the Senate's authority at home was never seriously challenged. The political system was designed to absorb military failure without systemic collapse. The Greek kingdoms were not. But manpower was only part of the equation. The other critical Roman advantage was logistics, the ability to sustain military operations across vast distances for extended periods. And this is where the Roman system separated itself from every other military power in the ancient world most dramatically. Projecting force from Italy to Greece required crossing the Adriatic Sea, maintaining naval supply lines, establishing forward bases on the Greek coast, and then feeding and equipping an army as it marched inland through difficult terrain. Every Roman campaign in Greece depended on this logistical chain. If the grain ships did not arrive, the army starved. If the replacement equipment did not come, the legions lost combat effectiveness. If the Adriatic was not kept open and secure, the entire expedition was cut off. Rome managed this challenge with a consistency that the Greek world could not match. The Roman Senate coordinated the contributions of allied Italian states, grain from Sicily and Sardinia, ships from the coastal cities of southern Italy, manpower from across the peninsula, into a supply system that could keep armies in the field overseas for years at a time. This was not glamorous work. It did not produce dramatic battlefield victories. No Roman general ever received a triumph for organising a grain convoy. But without it, no Roman army could have operated in Greece for more than a single campaigning season. The Greek kingdoms operated on fundamentally different logistical assumptions. Macedon fought on its own territory, or in the immediate neighbourhood. Its supply lines were short. Its soldiers could draw on local resources. It did not need to project force across a sea or sustain operations thousands of miles from home. This was an advantage in defensive wars. Philip and Perseus both used the short Macedonian supply lines to sustain their armies during the frustrating early phases of the Second and Third Macedonian Wars. But it was also a limitation. Macedon could not sustain extended offensive operations far from home. Philip's attempts to project power across the Aegean and into Asia Minor had stretched his resources to the breaking point even before Rome intervened. Antiochus faced the opposite version of this problem. His empire was so vast that simply moving an army from one end to the other took months. The force he brought to Greece was a fraction of his total military strength, not because he lacked soldiers, but because he could not move his full army across thousands of miles of territory fast enough to concentrate it before the Romans forced a battle. At Magnesia, he had assembled a huge force, but the logistics of feeding and supplying that army in Western Asia Minor were already straining his capacity. A prolonged campaign on that scale would have been economically ruinous even without a military defeat. Rome's logistical system was not perfect. Roman armies in Greece frequently suffered from supply shortages, especially during the difficult opening phases of campaigns. But the system was resilient. It could recover from disruptions. It could scale up. And most importantly, it was institutionalized. It did not depend on any single commander's genius. When one consul left office and another took over, the supply system continued to function because it was managed by the Senate and the permanent administrative structures of the Republic, not by the individual general in the field. This institutional continuity was perhaps Rome's most underappreciated advantage. Greek kingdoms were personal monarchies. The quality of military and political leadership depended entirely on the abilities of the reigning king. Philip V was aggressive and energetic but strategically reckless. Perseus was cautious and financially capable, but paralysed by indecision at critical moments. Antiochus III was a brilliant campaigner who made catastrophic diplomatic miscalculations. Each king's personal strengths and weaknesses shaped his kingdom's military performance directly, because there was no institutional structure to compensate for individual failings. Rome's system of rotating annual commands had obvious drawbacks. It produced incompetent generals like Crassus and Mancinus, who wasted entire campaigning seasons. But it also meant that no single bad leader could lose the war permanently. The system self-corrected. Bad commanders were replaced. Lessons from failed campaigns were absorbed by the Senate. The centurions deserved particular attention, because they were the element of the Roman military system that had no equivalent in the Greek world. These were professional career soldiers who served for decades, rising through the ranks on the basis of demonstrated combat ability and leadership under fire. They commanded the individual sentries and maniples that made up the legion. They were the men who, at Cynocephalae, led their soldiers into the gaps in Philip's phalanx without orders from Flamininus. They were the men who, at Pydna, identified the fractures in Perseus's line and exploited them in real time. They were the tactical intelligence of the Roman army, distributed across hundreds of small units, each capable of independent action. The Macedonian phalanx had nothing like this. Its junior officers existed to maintain formation discipline, to keep the ranks dressed, the spacing even, and the pikes level. Independent tactical initiative was not just unnecessary in the phalanx system, it was dangerous. The phalanx worked because every man did exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. Creativity at the unit level would break the formation. The system was optimized for one scenario, and it was devastating in that scenario, but it had no capacity to adapt when conditions changed, because adaptation was not built into the structure. This is the structural factor that decided the conquest of Greece, not a single battle, not a single general, not a secret weapon, or a stroke of luck. It was the accumulated advantage of a military and political system designed for sustained, adaptive, long-term warfare, matched against kingdoms designed to win or lose everything in a single afternoon, and that advantage compounded over time. Each war taught Rome more about Greek terrain, Greek politics, and Greek military methods. Each war expanded Rome's network of Greek allies and informants. Each war gave Roman officers direct experience fighting the phalanx and understanding its weaknesses. By the time of Pydna, Roman commanders knew exactly how to beat the Macedonian system, not because they were geniuses, but because 3 wars and 50 years of accumulated institutional learning had given them a playbook that worked. Greece never had the opportunity to develop a similar playbook against Rome, because Greece never survived its mistakes long enough to learn from them. There is another dimension to Rome's conquest of Greece that military analysis alone does not capture, and it is one that the Greeks themselves understood painfully well, even as it was happening to them. Rome did not just defeat Greek armies. Rome dismantled the Greek world politically, systematically, over decades, using diplomacy as precisely as it used legions, and in many ways the diplomatic campaign was more devastating than the military one, because it turned the Greeks into instruments of their own destruction. The Greek world that Rome encountered when it first crossed the Adriatic was not unified. It had never been unified. This was not a weakness that Rome created. It was the fundamental condition of Greek political life, stretching back centuries before Rome became a significant power. The Greek city-states and leagues had spent their entire history fighting each other, Athens against Sparta, Thebes against both, the Achaean League against the Aetolian League, every minor city jealously guarding its independence against every neighbour. Even under Macedonian dominance, this pattern had continued. Philip II and Alexander had imposed a degree of order through military supremacy, but the underlying rivalries never disappeared. The moment Macedonian power weakened, they resurfaced. Rome did not create Greek disunity, but Rome exploited it with a ruthlessness and consistency that no previous power had matched. Every Roman intervention in Greece followed the same diplomatic pattern. Identify the strongest Greek power in the region. Identify that power's local enemies. Ally with the enemies. Use them to weaken the target. Then, once the target is defeated, manage the allies to ensure that none of them becomes strong enough to replace the power that was just destroyed. The Aetolian League was the first to learn this lesson. During the First Macedonian War, Rome allied with the Aetolians against Philip. The Aetolians did the fighting, suffered the casualties, and absorbed the devastation of Macedonian reprisals against their territory. When Rome made peace with Philip at Phoenice, the Aetolians were left exposed and bitter. During the Second Macedonian War, Rome allied with the Achaean League and other Greek states against Philip, including some of the same states that had been Philip's allies just years earlier. After Cynoscephalae, Rome rewarded its new allies and sidelined the Aetolians, who had expected to receive the territorial gains they had been promised. The Aetolians, feeling cheated and used, turned to Antiochus, which gave Rome the pretext to crush Aetolian power permanently after Magnesia. The Achaean League watched the Aetolian experience and drew what seemed like the obvious conclusion: stay loyal to Rome no matter what. The Achaeans maintained their Roman alliance through the Second Macedonian War, the war against Antiochus, and the Third Macedonian War. They contributed troops, they provided bases, they suppressed pro-Macedonian sentiment within their own ranks, and their reward after Pydna was to have 1,000 of their leading citizens deported to Italy on suspicion of insufficient enthusiasm. The message was devastating. The Aetolians had been punished for opposing Rome. The Achaeans were being punished for being allied with Rome but not being allied enough. This pattern, rewarding cooperation with suspicion and punishing defiance with annihilation created a political environment in Greece that was profoundly corrosive. Greek leaders found themselves trapped. Supporting Rome meant accepting humiliation, submitting to arbitrary interference in internal affairs, and watching their own political autonomy erode year by year. Opposing Rome meant military destruction. There was no third option. No Greek state was powerful enough to maintain genuine independence, and no coalition of Greek states could hold together long enough to present a united front, because Rome's diplomats were constantly working to ensure that any such coalition was undermined before it could form. The Romans understood something about Greek politics that the Greeks themselves were slow to recognize. Greek political culture valued public debate, open assembly, and competitive rhetoric. Greek assemblies were places where rival politicians argued openly about policy, alliance, and strategy. This made Greek decision-making transparent in a way that Roman decision-making was not. The Roman Senate deliberated behind closed doors. Its debates were not public. Its diplomatic instructions to commanders and envoys were confidential. Roman policy toward Greece was formulated in private by a small group of senior senators who had access to intelligence from across the Mediterranean, and it was executed through envoys who had broad discretionary authority to make deals, issue threats, and manipulate local politics. Greek politicians, by contrast, had to make their arguments in public assemblies, where Roman agents could observe every speech, every vote, and every factional alignment. Rome always knew which Greek politicians were sympathetic and which were hostile. Greek states rarely had comparable intelligence about Roman intentions. The information asymmetry was enormous, and Rome exploited it relentlessly. Roman envoys arriving in a Greek city would meet privately with pro-Roman politicians, provide them with intelligence about Rome's intentions, and coach them on what arguments to make in the assembly. They would identify anti-Roman politicians and work to isolate them, sometimes through diplomatic pressure, sometimes through economic leverage, sometimes through more direct methods. The Roman Senate maintained what amounted to a network of political clients across the Greek world, Greek leaders whose careers and safety depended on Roman favour, and who could be relied upon to support Roman interests in their local assemblies. This system was extraordinarily effective, and it was also extraordinarily demoralizing for the Greeks who lived under it. The political life of the Greek city-states, which had once been a source of fierce civic pride, became a performance staged for Roman observers. Assembly debates that appeared to be free discussions of policy were in reality carefully managed competitions between Roman-backed factions and their opponents, with the outcome often predetermined by which side had received Roman support. The psychological toll of this arrangement should not be underestimated. The Greeks were not a people accustomed to subordination. They had invented the concept of political freedom as they understood it, the right of a citizen community to govern itself without external interference. They had fought the Persian Empire to defend that principle. They had built their entire cultural identity around the distinction between Greek freedom and barbarian servitude, and now they were being governed, in practice if not in name, by a power that most Greeks still considered culturally inferior. Roman commanders mispronounced Greek names. Roman soldiers trampled through sacred sites without understanding their significance. Roman envoys delivered ultimatums to assemblies that had been debating policy since before Rome was anything more than a collection of mud huts on the Tiber. The resentment this generated was deep and enduring. It expressed itself in small acts of defiance, in bitter jokes, in philosophical treatises about the nature of freedom and tyranny that were understood by everyone to be commentaries on the current situation, and occasionally it expressed itself in outbursts of violent resistance, like the Achaean revolt that ended with the destruction of Corinth. But resentment alone does not explain why the Greeks failed to mount an effective collective resistance to Rome. Other conquered peoples in the ancient world managed to form coalitions against dominant powers. The reason the Greeks could not was structural, rooted in the same political fragmentation that had defined Greek life for centuries. The Greek city-state system was built on the principle that each polis was sovereign and independent. Leagues and confederations existed, but they were always loose, always contested, and always vulnerable to internal disagreement. The Achaean League was the most successful example of Greek federal organization, and even it was plagued by constant disputes between its member cities over policy, leadership, and the distribution of resources. Getting the Achaean League to agree on a single course of action required lengthy debate, political negotiation, and compromise. Getting the Achaean League the Aetolian League, the Boeotian League, and the remaining Macedonian state to coordinate a unified military strategy against Rome would have required a degree of political cooperation that Greek states had never achieved in their entire history. Rome, by contrast, operated as a single strategic actor. The Senate made decisions, commanders executed them. Allied contingents were integrated into Roman armies under Roman command. There was no negotiation between equal partners about strategy or objectives. The Roman system was hierarchical, centralized, and capable of sustained, coordinated action across multiple theatres simultaneously. The Greek world was fragmented, decentralized, and capable of coordinated action only in brief exceptional moments, usually when the threat was so immediate and so obvious that factional rivalries were temporarily set aside. By the time that happened, it was always too late. Philip V understood this problem. During the Second Macedonian War, he tried to hold together a coalition of Greek allies against Rome. It fell apart because the Achaean League switched sides, because Flamininus's diplomatic campaign was more effective than Philip's, and because individual Greek cities calculated that their immediate local interests were better served by siding with Rome than by joining a Macedonian-led resistance. Perseus faced the same problem during the Third Macedonian War. Despite widespread Greek sympathy for his cause, almost no Greek state was willing to commit openly to his side, because the risks of backing a loser against Rome were too catastrophic to contemplate. Even the Achaean Revolt, the last armed Greek resistance to Rome, illustrated the problem. Critolaus managed to assemble a coalition of sorts, bringing the Boeotian League and Chalcis into an alliance with the Achaean League. But major Greek states stayed out. Athens, which had its own grievances against Rome, remained neutral. The remnants of Macedon, just recently crushed after their own failed revolt, were in no position to help. The coalition Critolaus built was too small, too poorly armed, and too hastily assembled to survive contact with a Roman army. The fundamental Greek failure was not military, it was political. The Greeks could not unite because their political system was designed to prevent the kind of centralized authority that unity required. Every Greek state feared domination by another Greek state almost as much as it feared domination by Rome. Corinth feared Spartan resurgence. Sparta feared Achaean domination. The Aetolians feared Macedonian expansion. Athens feared everyone. These local rivalries were not petty distractions from the real threat. They were the central reality of Greek political life, and Rome understood them better than the Greeks understood Rome. In the end, Rome conquered Greece not by being stronger than all of Greece combined, though it may have been, but by ensuring that it never had to face all of Greece combined. It fought the Greek world in pieces, one kingdom at a time, one league at a time, one city at a time, and each piece, once defeated, was incorporated into the Roman system in a way that made it harder for the remaining pieces to resist. By the time the last piece fell, by the time the smoke cleared over the ruins of Corinth, there was nothing left to resist with. The armies were destroyed, the leagues were dissolved, the political leaders were dead, exiled, or detained. The wealth had been confiscated, and the will to fight had been broken by 70 years of demonstration that fighting Rome led only to devastation. The conquest was complete, but understanding why it happened the way it did requires one more step, looking at what it cost, what it meant, and what it tells us about how power actually works in the long run. The destruction of Corinth did not just end Greek independence, it ended an era. For 5 centuries, the Greek city-states had been the most dynamic political and military civilization in the Mediterranean world. They had defeated the Persian Empire, colonized coastlines from the Black Sea to Spain, invented forms of government and military organization that shaped the ancient world, and produced a cultural output in philosophy, literature, art, architecture, and science that remains foundational to Western civilization. All of that political and military energy was now extinguished. The Greek world after Corinth was a world of subjects, not actors. Greeks would continue to write, to think, to teach, and to create, but they would never again decide their own collective fate. The cost of the conquest fell unevenly, and understanding where it landed hardest reveals something important about how Rome's victory actually functioned on the ground. The heaviest cost was paid by ordinary people, the populations of cities and regions that found themselves on the wrong side of Roman decisions. The 150,000 Epiriots enslaved after Pydna were not soldiers. Most of them were farmers, craftsmen, women, children, and elderly people whose only crime was living in a region whose leaders had backed the wrong side. The tens of thousands of Corinthians sold into slavery after Mummius's sack were not combatants. They were the residents of a commercial city who had been unable or unwilling to flee before the Roman army arrived. The scale of human displacement across the Greek world during the decades of Roman conquest was staggering. Entire communities were uprooted. Populations that had lived in the same regions for generations were scattered across the slave markets of the Mediterranean, from Italy to North Africa to the Aegean Islands. The economic disruption was equally severe. Greece in the 2nd century before Christ was not a poor region. The Greek city-states and kingdoms generated significant wealth through agriculture, manufacturing, and above all trade. Corinth's destruction alone eliminated one of the most important commercial hubs in the Mediterranean. The breakup of Macedon disrupted the timber trade, the mining industry, and the agricultural networks that had sustained the Macedonian economy. The war indemnities imposed on defeated states drained capital out of the Greek world and into the Roman treasury. The confiscation of art, precious metals, and luxury goods stripped Greek cities of accumulated wealth that represented centuries of productive activity. But the economic damage went beyond direct confiscation. The political instability created by decades of Roman intervention disrupted the trade networks that Greek prosperity depended on. Merchants could not operate effectively when the political status of ports and markets changed unpredictably based on Roman diplomatic decisions. Investment in long-term economic activity, the political class suffered in a different way. The deportation of 1,000 Achaean leaders after Pydna was not just a punishment, it was a decapitation of Greek political life. These were the men who ran the assemblies, managed the finances, conducted diplomacy, and provided the institutional memory of their communities. Removing them did not just weaken the Achaean League in the short term, it destroyed a generation of political experience and expertise that could not be quickly replaced. The young men who stepped into leadership roles after the deportations were less experienced, less connected, and less capable of managing the complex relationship with Rome that Greek survival required. Some of them, like Critolaus, channeled their inexperience into reckless defiance. Others became compliant tools of Roman policy, lacking the skill or the standing to push back, even when Roman demands were unreasonable. This pattern, the systematic removal of capable, experienced leadership, was one of the most effective tools in Rome's arsenal, and it was applied consistently across the Greek world. After every war, Rome identified the most capable and influential leaders in the defeated states and neutralized them. Some were killed, some were exiled, some were brought to Rome as hostages or detainees. The effect was to ensure that Greek communities were led by men who were either too weak to resist or too dependent on Roman favour to try. It was a strategy of deliberate political degradation, and it worked precisely because it targeted the human infrastructure of governance rather than physical infrastructure. The military cost to Greece was total and permanent. The Macedonian army, the last Greek military force capable of facing Rome in a pitched battle, was destroyed at Pydna and never rebuilt. The Macedonian kingdom was abolished. The Achaean League's military was annihilated at Scarpheia and Corinth, and the League itself dissolved. After the settlement that followed Corinth's destruction, no Greek state was permitted to maintain military forces of any significance. Greece was effectively demilitarized. Security, such as it was provided by Roman garrisons and the Roman fleet. Greek communities that had once defended their own walls, patrolled their own borders, and fielded their own armies were now dependent on a foreign power for basic physical protection. This demilitarization had psychological consequences that went beyond the practical loss of military capability. For the Greeks, the ability to bear arms in defense of the community was not just a practical necessity, it was a defining feature of citizenship. The Greek citizen was, by definition, a soldier citizen, a man who participated in the political life of his city and fought in its defense. The two roles were inseparable in Greek political thought. Stripping Greek communities of their military capacity did not just make them vulnerable. It undermined the very concept of citizenship that Greek political identity was built on. A Greek man who could not fight for his city was, in the deepest cultural sense, no longer fully a citizen. He was something else, a subject, a dependent, a person whose safety was guaranteed by someone else's army. The cultural consequences of the conquest were more complex and took longer to manifest. In the immediate aftermath, Greek culture was not suppressed. Rome had no interest in destroying Greek learning, Greek art, or Greek language. On the contrary, Roman elites were increasingly fascinated by Greek culture. Wealthy Romans hired Greek tutors for their children. Greek philosophy, rhetoric, and literature became essential components of elite Roman education. Greek artists and craftsmen found eager patrons among the Roman aristocracy. The great works of Greek sculpture, painting, and decorative art that Mummius and other commanders shipped back to Rome fueled a cultural transformation in the capital. Roman literature, architecture, and visual art were profoundly reshaped by Greek models. The Roman poet Horace would later capture this dynamic in a line that became famous: "Conquered Greece took its conqueror captive and introduced the arts to rustic Rome." There was real truth in this observation. Greek cultural influence on Rome was enormous and lasting. But it is important to understand what this cultural exchange actually looked like from the Greek side. Greek artists and intellectuals did not come to Rome as equal partners in a cultural dialogue. They came as dependents, employees, and in many cases, as slaves. The 1,000 Achaean detainees included Polybius, who became one of the most important historians of the ancient world, but he wrote his history as a captive in a foreign country, dependent on the patronage of Roman aristocrats for his physical freedom. Greek tutors in Roman households were often enslaved men. Greek artists working for Roman patrons created works that served Roman tastes and Roman purposes, not their own. The flow of Greek culture into Rome was real, but it was not a rescue of Greek civilization. It was an extraction. The best minds, the best artists, the best works of art were removed from Greece and transplanted into a Roman context where they served Roman interests. Greece itself was left culturally diminished, not because the Romans burned libraries or banned philosophy, but because the most talented and ambitious Greeks increasingly had to leave Greece to find opportunities. Rome and its expanding empire offered patronage, wealth, and audience, on a scale that impoverished, depopulated Greece could no longer provide. The result over generations was a slow draining of creative and intellectual energy from the Greek homeland to the Roman centre. This pattern, military conquest followed by cultural extraction, would repeat itself throughout Roman history. Rome conquered Carthage and absorbed Punic engineering and agricultural knowledge. Rome conquered Egypt and absorbed Egyptian administrative techniques and religious practices. Rome conquered the Celtic and Germanic peoples and incorporated their military traditions. In every case, the conquered culture enriched Rome while the conquered territory was diminished. Greece was simply the most prominent and consequential example of a process that was fundamental to how the Roman Empire grew and sustained itself. But the Greek case was also unique in one important respect. No other conquered people had as profound an impact on the conqueror's identity. Roman religion, Roman philosophy, Roman literature, Roman architecture, Roman law, Roman education, all of these were transformed by Greek influence to a degree that made later Roman civilization almost unrecognizable compared to the rough, practical military culture of the early Republic. The Rome that conquered Greece was a society of farmer soldiers who valued discipline, practicality, and ancestral tradition above all else. The Rome that emerged from the conquest, gradually over the following century, was a cosmopolitan imperial culture that conducted its intellectual life in Greek categories, decorated its public spaces with Greek art, and educated its children in Greek literature and philosophy. Whether this transformation was a triumph or a corruption depends on where you stand. Roman traditionalists like Cato the Elder saw Greek cultural influence as a poison that was softening Roman character and undermining the military virtues that had built the Republic. Greek intellectuals like Polybius saw it as proof that Greek civilization was more durable than Greek political independence, that the ideas and achievements of Greece would outlast the temporary humiliation of conquest. Both perspectives contained truth. Greek culture survived and even flourished within the Roman system. Greek political freedom did not. And for the people who actually lived through the conquest, the citizens of Corinth watching their city burn, the Epirot families separated on the auction blocks of Italian slave markets, the Achaean politicians rotting in Italian detention, the Macedonian farmers watching their kingdom divided into pieces by foreign commissioners, the consolation that their culture would someday reshape their conquerors was no consolation at all. What matters for them, and what matters for anyone trying to extract meaning from this history, is not the cultural legacy, it is the strategic reality. And the strategic reality is stark. The strategic reality is this: Rome conquered Greece because Rome was built to fight long wars and Greece was not. Every other factor, the superiority of the legion over the phalanx, the diplomatic manipulation of Greek rivalries, the ruthless punishment of resistance, the cultural extraction that followed military victory, all of these flowed from that single structural difference. Rome could sustain military and political pressure across decades, across multiple theatres, through repeated setbacks, because the Roman system was designed from the ground up for endurance. The Greek system was designed for decisive moments. And in a contest between endurance and decisiveness, endurance wins every time. Not because it does not mean that the Greeks were foolish or incompetent. Philip V was a shrewd and energetic commander who understood his strategic situation clearly. His decision to ally with Hannibal was rational. If Carthage had won the Second Punic War, Philip would have been on the winning side and Rome would have been permanently weakened. Antiochus III had reconquered more territory than any Hellenistic king since Alexander. Perseus held off Roman armies for 2 full years with a strategy that was sound in both conception and execution. The Achaean leaders who tried to resist Roman encroachment were not deluded. They understood what Roman domination meant for Greek political life, and they were willing to fight against it. At every stage, Greek leaders made decisions that were rational, given the information and options available to them. The problem was not Greek decision-making. The problem was that the Greek world was operating within a system that had a fatal structural limitation: the inability to sustain a collective, long-term strategic effort against a persistent external threat. Each Greek state, each kingdom, each league made its own calculations independently. Philip fought Rome alone. Antiochus fought Rome alone. Perseus fought Rome nearly alone, despite widespread Greek sympathy for his cause. The Achaean League fought Rome alone, with only minor support from the Boeotians and Chalcis. At no point during 70 years of Roman expansion in Greece did the Greek world manage to assemble a unified coalition capable of matching Roman resources and Roman persistence. This was not because the Greeks lacked the intelligence to see what was happening. Polybius, writing from his detention in Rome, analysed the pattern with extraordinary clarity. He understood that Rome's strength lay in its system, not in any individual commander or any single military advantage. He understood that Greek disunity was the critical enabler of Roman expansion. He watched, with the helpless precision of a historian who could see the mechanism clearly but could not stop it, as the Greek world was dismantled one piece at a time. His analysis remains one of the most penetrating accounts of imperial expansion ever written, precisely because he was both a participant and a victim. The question Polybius wrestled with, and the question that makes this history relevant beyond the ancient world, is whether the outcome was inevitable. Was Rome's conquest of Greece the unavoidable result of structural forces that no individual decision could have changed? Or were there moments when different choices might have produced a different outcome? The honest answer is that there were such moments, but they were fewer and narrower than they appear in retrospect. The most significant was the period immediately after Cannae, when Philip allied with Hannibal. If Philip had committed fully to the alliance, if he had sent a substantial Macedonian army to Italy to support Hannibal, instead of conducting a limited, cautious campaign in the Adriatic, the combined pressure might have broken Rome's ability to fight on 2 fronts. Hannibal himself reportedly believed this. The Carthaginian general understood that Rome's survival depended on its ability to keep the war contained to familiar theatres. A Macedonian army landing in southern Italy, while Hannibal controlled the centre of the peninsula, could have shattered the Italian alliance system that was the foundation of Roman military manpower. But Philip held back. He lacked the naval capacity for a major amphibious operation, and he was unwilling to commit his kingdom's resources to a gamble on Italian soil. The window closed, and it never opened again with the same potential. A second moment came during the war against Antiochus. Hannibal, advising the Seleucid king, proposed exactly the strategy that might have worked: an invasion of Italy combined with a campaign in Greece, forcing Rome to split its forces across multiple theatres simultaneously. Antiochus rejected this advice, partly out of personal jealousy toward Hannibal, partly out of overconfidence in his own abilities, and partly because the logistics of launching a simultaneous 2-front war across the Mediterranean were genuinely daunting. Had Antiochus followed Hannibal's counsel, the outcome is impossible to predict with certainty. but it would have been the most serious strategic challenge Rome had faced since Cannae itself. A third moment came during the Third Macedonian War, after Perseus's cavalry victory at Callinicus. For a brief period, the Greek world wavered. States that had been quietly sympathetic to Macedon were reconsidering their alignment. If Perseus had followed up his victory aggressively, if he had spent the money in his treasury to hire mercenaries, subsidize wavering Greek states, and launch a major offensive while the Roman army was demoralized, he might have built the coalition that his father and Antiochus had both failed to assemble. Instead, he offered peace. He hesitated, he hoarded his gold, and the moment passed. Each of these missed opportunities shares a common feature. In every case, the Greek or Hellenistic leader had to take an enormous risk, commit everything, accept the possibility of total loss, and gamble on a strategy that might fail catastrophically. And in every case, the leader chose caution. Philip held back from Italy. Antiochus rejected Hannibal's bold plan. Perseus offered negotiations instead of pressing his advantage. This caution was not irrational. The risks were genuinely enormous. But it reflects a fundamental asymmetry in the strategic situation. Rome could afford to lose. Greek kingdoms could not. Rome's system meant that a lost battle, a failed campaign, even a lost war could be survived and recovered from. For Philip, for Antiochus, for Perseus, a single catastrophic defeat meant the end of their dynasty, their kingdom, and their civilization's independence. This asymmetry of consequences made Greek leaders inherently more cautious than their Roman counterparts, even when boldness was the only strategy that had a chance of succeeding. Rome, by contrast, could afford to be bold precisely because the consequences of failure were manageable. Roman commanders who lost battles were replaced. Roman armies that were destroyed were reconstituted. The Republic absorbed punishments that would have ended any Greek kingdom and kept fighting. This meant that Rome could take risks that Greek leaders could not, sending armies across the Adriatic into unfamiliar territory, forcing battles on unfavourable terms, accepting early defeats as the price of long-term strategic learning. Rome did not need to be right the first time, it only needed to be right eventually. This asymmetry is the deepest explanation for Rome's conquest of Greece, and it carries implications far beyond the ancient world. It suggests that in any prolonged strategic competition, the advantage lies not with the side that is stronger in any single moment, but with the side that can best absorb setbacks and sustain effort over time. Military brilliance, cultural sophistication, economic wealth, and strategic intelligence all matter. But they matter less than the ability to persist, to keep showing up, keep adapting, keep applying pressure, long after the opponent has exhausted the resources or the political will to continue. Rome showed up. Year after year, war after war, setback after setback. Rome showed up with another army, another commander, another diplomatic initiative, another round of pressure, and eventually the Greek world, for all its brilliance and all its achievements, simply ran out of capacity to resist. That is the story of how Rome conquered Greece, not through genius, not through a single decisive victory, not through cultural superiority or divine favour, through structure, through system, through the relentless, grinding institutional persistence of a republic that was built to endure, matched against kingdoms that were built to win or die, and that ultimately died because they could not win quickly enough. The ruins of Corinth smouldered for days. Across the Greek world the smoke was not visible, but the message was. An entire civilization's political independence had ended not with a single dramatic fall, but through a slow, methodical process that most Greeks did not fully recognize until it was too late. The leagues were dissolved, the armies were gone, the kings were dead or in chains, and the cities that had debated philosophy, invented democracy, and fielded the most feared infantry formations the ancient world had ever seen, now waited quietly for instructions from Rome. What remains, after all the campaigns and battles and burned cities, is a question that every generation has to answer for itself. What actually decides the fate of nations? Is it the quality of their armies, the brilliance of their leaders, the richness of their culture, the courage of their citizens? This history suggests something less dramatic and more uncomfortable. What decides the fate of nations is the quality of their systems, the structures they build to sustain effort over time, to absorb failure without collapsing, to replace leaders without losing direction, and to keep functioning long after the initial crisis has passed. Rome did not produce better soldiers than Macedon. It did not produce better generals than the Greek world. It produced a better system, one that could take a defeat at Cannae and still be standing 20 years later, one that could send in competent commanders to Greece for 2 consecutive years and still win the war in the third, one that could fight on 4 fronts simultaneously and sustain all of them. Greece produced Aristotle, Euclid, Phidias, and Alexander. Rome produced roads, supply depots, rotating magistracies, and alliance networks that held together under catastrophic pressure. In the long run, the roads and supply depots won, not because they were more impressive, because they were more durable. The last Achaean detainees were finally released from Italy and allowed to return to Greece roughly 17 years after Pydna. By that time, most of them had died in detention. The survivors who made it home found a Greece that had moved on without them, quieter, poorer, and thoroughly Roman in its political orientation. Polybius, one of the survivors, went on to finish his histories, documenting with painful precision the process by which his world had been absorbed into someone else's empire. He did not write with bitterness. He wrote with the clear-eyed recognition that Rome had won not because of fortune or injustice, but because of a structural superiority that the Greek world had never found an answer to. If you've made it this far in this documentary, you understand something that most quick summaries of ancient history miss entirely. The conquest of Greece was not a highlight reel of dramatic battles. It was a 70-year demonstration of what happens when a system built for endurance meets a civilization built for brilliance. Brilliance wins the moments. Endurance wins the era. If this story changed the way you think about how power works, not just in the ancient world, but in any era, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. History is not just about what happened. It is about what it tells us about what will happen next. Corinth was eventually rebuilt a century later by Julius Caesar. Roman colonists moved in. New temples went up over the old foundations. A Roman city grew where a Greek city had burned. But beneath the new marble, archaeologists would one day find that fused layer of roof tiles, melted bronze, and charred wood, the compressed residue of a single day of destruction that ended 5 centuries of Greek freedom. The ground remembers even when the people who walk on it have forgotten. And that is how Rome conquered Greece.